If you've ever walked through a museum and thought, wow, these statues look kind of creepy, like they might come alive any second, then you'd feel right at home in Pompeii. Except, here the statues are not just art pieces, they're real people, or at least the shapes of real people, caught in their final, desperate moments. And no, they're not moving anytime soon. Time in Pompeii stopped almost 2,000 years ago, and it never restarted. Let's begin with the scene today. Imagine stepping into a place where the streets are made of huge, uneven stones, where deep grooves show the tracks of ancient Roman carts. On either side, there are broken walls, faded frescoes, and houses that feel like someone just stepped out to grab some bread, except no one ever came back. The air is quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence where you half expect a stray dog to bark just to break the mood. But no, Pompeii is like a movie, paused forever. Now, to set the stage, let's roll back the years. In 79 AD, Pompeii wasn't a ruin. It was alive, loud, bustling. It smelled of baked bread, wine, maybe a bit of sewage if we're being honest, and roasted meat from street vendors. Kids ran through alleys, merchants shouted over prices, and aristocrats probably complained about how hot the bathwater was. Life was normal, ordinary. That's what makes what happened so chilling.
But here's the thing. When you walk through Pompeii today, you don't see life. You see the moment death froze everything in place. You see plaster casts of people curled on the ground, hands covering faces, mothers clutching babies, even dogs still chained to their posts. It's like the world hit the pause button at the worst possible time. And now, thousands of years later, we get to walk around and peek into this ancient snapshot. Creepy? Yes. Fascinating? Definitely. What's more unsettling is the way the city feels familiar. There's something about the bakery ovens, the graffiti on walls. Yes, Romans loved scribbling insults and love notes, and the layout of houses that makes it all too modern. Pompeii wasn't some distant fantasy land. It was just people like us, trying to live their lives, arguing, hustling, flirting, and stressing about money. Kind of like us, except with togas. And then came the day when the mountain decided to blow. Mount Vesuvius, the massive volcano looming nearby, was always part of the background. Like that grumpy neighbor who never smiles. People knew it was there, but they didn't think too much about it. I mean, if your mountain hadn't erupted in your lifetime, would you worry? Nah. They got used to small tremors, shrugged them off, and went on with their parties. They couldn't imagine the giant would one day smother the entire city. That's the secret lurking beneath Pompeii's silence today. When you stand in its empty streets, you feel the weight of all those lives suddenly interrupted. You see doorways that lead to nowhere, frozen shops with half-finished goods, and amphitheaters that will never again hear cheers. It's haunting because it reminds us how fragile everything is. But here's the thing, Pompeii isn't just about tragedy, it's also about discovery. For centuries, the city lay hidden under layers of ash, like some weird time capsule. Nobody even knew it was down there. Farmers plowed fields over it, vines grew thick, and life moved on above the buried ruins. Until, finally, centuries later, explorers stumbled upon it. Imagine their shock when they realized an entire city was sleeping just under their feet. And when archaeologists started digging, oh boy, they uncovered streets, temples, theaters, houses, everything. It was like opening a treasure chest. But instead of gold coins and jewels, they found life, everyday life, with all its messy details. Bread loaves still sitting in ovens, jars of wine sealed shut, paintings on bedroom walls that were, let's just say, not very family-friendly. Yes, Pompeii had a wild side. We'll get to that in a later chapter, promise. Walking through Pompeii today, you get this strange double feeling. On one hand, it's amazing, like stepping back in time. On the other hand, it's deeply sad. You know what's coming, but the people of Pompeii didn't. They woke up that morning thinking it was just another day. They went shopping, worked in fields, planned dinner parties. They had no clue they were living their last hours. And that's the dark beauty of Pompeii. It's not just ruins, it's a story, a warning, a reminder that nature doesn't care how rich, powerful, or busy you are. When the earth decides to speak, it speaks loud. So here we are, centuries later, walking their silent streets by torchlight, listening to echoes of laughter, gossip, and fear that once filled the air. Pompeii isn't just frozen in time, it's whispering to us, telling us about life, death, and the thin line between the two. And as we move forward deeper into this story, we'll uncover more than just ash and ruins. We'll uncover the darker secrets that Pompeii tried to hide, the pleasures, the sins, the warnings ignored. For now, remember this: Pompeii isn't just a dead city, it's a mirror, showing us what happens when we take life and time for granted. If you stood on a hillside above Pompeii 2,000 years ago, you would have thought, wow, this place has it all. And honestly, you'd be right. Forget New York or Dubai. In its prime, Pompeii was one of the shining jewels of the Roman world. A buzzing little city with money flowing in, food in plenty, and entertainment on every corner. It was like Rome's fancy cousin, but with better weather. Let's paint the scene. Pompeii sat right near the Bay of Naples, on the coast of southern Italy. The bay itself was stunning, a stretch of blue water dotted with ships sailing in and out, bringing goods from all over the Mediterranean. The land was rich, fertile, and green. Why? Because the giant volcano looming nearby, Mount Vesuvius, had spilled out its minerals over centuries. Sure, a volcano was a bit scary, but it was also the reason the soil was so ridiculously good. Grapes, olives, figs, grain, you name it, it grew here. Farmers basically had a jackpot. And the city? It wasn't just farmland with a few houses. Pompeii was alive. Its streets were paved with big stone blocks with sidewalks for people to walk on. Yes, Romans had sidewalks before us. Shops lined the streets, from bakeries to wine taverns, and there were public fountains for fresh water. The city even had a pretty clever system to keep things clean. Stepping stones across the road so you could avoid the puddles of, well, let's just say mystery liquids flowing down. Practical, if not glamorous. The heart of it all was the Forum, the main square. Imagine a wide open plaza surrounded by tall columns and important buildings. This was where business deals happened, politicians gave speeches, and merchants set up their stalls. People came here to gossip, argue, pray, and buy everything from bread to jewelry. If you wanted to know what was going on in Pompeii, you only had to spend an hour in the Forum. But Pompeii wasn't just about work and politics. The city was beautiful. Roman architects knew their stuff. Houses were decorated with colorful frescoes, paintings of gods, nature scenes, and sometimes, let's be honest, things that were not safe for bedtime stories. Mosaics covered the floors, sparkling with tiny tiles and elaborate patterns. Wealthy homes even had little indoor gardens with fountains and pools where fish swam lazily in the sun. Imagine sitting on a marble bench, sipping wine, while a servant fanned you with a palm leaf. That was everyday life for the elite. And oh, the baths. Romans loved their public baths, and Pompeii had several. These weren't just for washing, they were like gyms, spas, and social clubs rolled into one. People went there to exercise, relax in hot water, gossip with friends, and maybe even close a business deal while soaking. Rich or poor, everyone had access. It was the great equalizer. Picture steam rising, tiled walls glistening, and chatter filling the air. It was basically the ancient version of a Starbucks lounge.
What made Pompeii truly shine, though, was its location. The city was plugged into the Roman trade network. Ships came in carrying wine from Greece, oils from Spain, perfumes from the East, and exotic goods from as far away as Egypt. In return, Pompeii exported its own wine and produce, which were highly prized. Pompeii's vineyards produced wine so famous that amphorae, those tall clay jars, have been found all across the empire, stamped with the city's mark. It was like a brand label. Drink Pompeian wine, and you were drinking the good stuff. This constant flow of goods made Pompeii a cultural melting pot. Foreign merchants strolled the streets, slaves from distant lands worked in homes, and travelers brought stories of faraway places. You could hear different languages, smell spices from other regions, and see fashions borrowed from abroad. For a city of around 20,000 people, Pompeii felt surprisingly cosmopolitan. Of course, wealth was not spread evenly. The elite lived in giant villas, while the poor crammed into modest apartments. Street vendors hustled to make a few coins, while nobles hosted banquets where food was piled so high you'd think they were feeding an army. But even the common folk had access to bakeries, taverns, and theaters. Entertainment was for everyone. The amphitheater, an oval arena that could hold about 20,000 spectators, was the pride of Pompeii. People flocked there to watch gladiators fight, animals perform, and musicians play. For a provincial city, it was quite the show.
Now, here's where the jewel part gets interesting. Pompeii had a reputation not only for its beauty and trade, but also for its lifestyle. People here liked to enjoy themselves. Work was important, but so was leisure. They threw festivals, worshipped gods with parades, and indulged in parties that sometimes got a bit out of hand. More on that in later chapters. Let's just say Pompeii's nightlife was legendary. The thing is, all this prosperity sat in the shadow of Vesuvius. The volcano wasn't exactly invisible, it was right there, looming in the background of daily life, its slopes covered in vineyards and farms. People knew it was a volcano, but they didn't really think of it as dangerous. It hadn't erupted in living memory. To them, Vesuvius was more like a giant hill that made their wine taste better. Looking back now, it feels eerie. The whole city thrived because of the very thing that would one day destroy it. The fertile soil, the booming wine trade, the comfortable lives. It was all thanks to Vesuvius. Pompeii's jewel-like shine was polished by volcanic dust, and nobody realized the price they would eventually pay. But let's not rush the tragedy just yet. At this point in our story, Pompeii was glittering. Its people were proud, its economy strong, its culture rich. Travelers marveled at its streets, merchants bragged about its markets, and poets wrote about its beauty. Pompeii was, in every sense, a jewel of Campania, sparkling, lively, and full of promise. What they didn't know was that jewels can crack. Beneath the laughter in the taverns and the cheers in the amphitheater, the mountain was restless. Silent, but restless. And soon, that silence would be broken. From the outside, Pompeii looked like a hard-working Roman city. Busy streets, carts rattling over stones, merchants yelling about their special prices. But step past the heavy wooden doors of the grand villas, and you'd find a very different world. A world where marble shone in candlelight, fountains splashed gently in courtyards, and the air smelled of roasted peacock, honey cakes, and maybe too much perfume. This was the world of Pompeii's elite, the rich and powerful families who made sure the city sparkled. And boy, did they know how to live. Let's start with the houses. Houses is honestly too small a word. These were mini palaces. The wealthy of Pompeii lived in sprawling villas with wide atriums, the main hall where a pool of water reflected sunlight from the open roof above. Yes, the Romans basically invented skylights before skylights were cool. From there, guests could wander into dining rooms decorated with wall-to-wall frescoes. Imagine entire murals of gods lounging on clouds, mythological battles, or exotic animals painted so brightly that even after 2,000 years, the colors still pop. Some rooms were less polite. Archaeologists uncovered frescoes in bedrooms and hidden chambers that were, let's just say, very adult-themed. Turns out the elites didn't exactly shy away from showing off their, private tastes. Even in a society famous for gladiator games and open baths, some of these images were eyebrow-raising. If walls could talk, the walls of Pompeii's villas would probably giggle before blushing.
But the villas weren't just about art. They were also about gardens. Roman elites loved their little Edens, even inside the city. Walk through one of these courtyards and you'd find trimmed hedges, marble statues, bubbling fountains, and sometimes even pools where fish swam. Picture this, a noble reclining on a couch, sipping imported wine, while slaves plucked harp strings nearby and cool water tinkled from a fountain. Not a bad Tuesday evening. Food, too, was a statement. Wealthy Pompeians didn't settle for boring meals. They had cooks trained to prepare dishes like roasted dormice, yes, actual mice, stuffed with nuts and honey, seafood fresh from the bay, and meats seasoned with garum, a fermented fish sauce so smelly yet so beloved that Romans put it on everything. And think of it as their ketchup, but way funkier. The fancier the feast, the more status you showed. Guests were expected to recline on couches around the table, picking at courses while debating philosophy or just gossiping about neighbors. Entertainment inside these homes also took many forms. Music, poetry readings, even small-scale plays could happen in a villa. Wealthy hosts often hired traveling performers, acrobats, or dancers, and of course, plenty of wine flowed. If you've ever had a party that got out of hand, just know the elites of Pompeii probably did it first, with more togas and fewer neighbors complaining about noise. Now, while the rich lived this glamorous life, they weren't doing it alone. Slaves formed the backbone of these households. Every villa was filled with servants who cooked, cleaned, poured wine, lit lamps, ran errands, and sometimes even managed accounts. In fact, a wealthy Pompeian could have dozens of slaves, each trained for specific tasks. Some lived decently, others suffered harsh conditions, but all were essential. The marble walls sparkled because someone else polished them. Another thing you'd notice behind those doors was status on full display. Elites loved showing off their family history. Busts of ancestors, stone heads of grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and whoever else they could remember lined the halls. It was like walking through a gallery of serious-looking faces, silently reminding everyone, this family has been important for a long time. Legacy mattered, and those marble heads made sure no guest forgot it. But here's where it gets interesting. For all their luxury, many elites lived in constant competition. Who had the bigger atrium? Who served the rarest wine? Who hosted the wildest feast? Pompeii's rich were locked in a social arms race, each trying to outshine the other. That's part of why their houses are still so jaw-dropping today. They weren't just living, they were showing off. Of course, all this luxury came with its fair share of whispers. The more extravagant the lifestyle, the juicier the rumors. Was Senator so-and-so cheating on his wife? Did that merchant really get rich by cheating the scales at the forum? Did the host of last week's banquet get too drunk and fall into his own fountain? Gossip was as alive in Pompeii as in any modern city, maybe even worse because the walls were thinner and the wine was stronger. Yet, behind all the marble, mosaics, and gossip, there was also a sense of fragility. The elites built their lives around wealth, beauty, and pleasure, but it all rested on shaky ground. Literally, earthquakes rattled Pompeii often. Just a few years before the eruption, a massive quake had damaged many buildings, and repairs were still ongoing when Vesuvius finally blew. Some houses looked fine on the outside, but had cracks hiding beneath their paint, kind of like their society, glamorous on the surface, fragile underneath. And maybe that's part of Pompeii's dark secret. Behind the shining marble walls was a city obsessed with appearances, with pleasure, with proving who was richer and more important. It's easy to admire the villas today, but it's also easy to see the warning signs. These people lived in luxury, but they didn't notice the shadow of the mountain growing darker every day. Walking through the ruins now, you can still sense their pride. You can stand in the atrium of the House of the Faun, where a massive mosaic of Alexander the Great once decorated the floor. You can trace the painted flowers in the Villa of the Mysteries, where ritual scenes play out in vivid red. You can almost hear the splash of fountains, the clink of wine cups, the whispered laughter of guests. And then, the silence reminds you, all of it ended in a single day. The marble walls still stand, but their owners are long gone. Their luxury is preserved, but their voices are not. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real story Pompeii whispers. Beauty can't save you, wealth can't shield you, and marble walls don't matter when the earth itself decides to take them back. So far, we've peeked behind the marble doors of Pompeii's rich. The mosaics, the fountains, the roasted peacocks. Pretty glamorous, right? But let's be real, most people in Pompeii didn't live like that. The majority weren't sipping wine in marble gardens. They were the bakers, the farmers, the street sellers, the slaves, the craftsmen hammering away in noisy workshops. If Pompeii was a theater, the elites were the stars, but the common folks were the crew, keeping the show running. Let's take a walk through their world. First stop, the insulae. These were the apartment blocks where many working-class families lived. Picture tall, cramped buildings made of wood and brick, packed with small rooms. The ground floor might hold a little shop, a tavern, a bakery, or maybe a smithy, and above it, tiny apartments stacked like shelves. Families squeezed into 1 or 2 rooms, cooking over smoky fires and sleeping on straw mats. Forget marble mosaics. Here, if your roof didn't leak when it rained, you were lucky. Life wasn't all misery, though. These neighborhoods were noisy, messy, but alive. Kids played in the streets, neighbors shouted greetings or insults, and the smell of bread baking drifted from local shops. Street food was everywhere. Cheese, sausages, lentil stew, and flatbread sold hot from ovens. If you didn't have a kitchen at home, no problem. You just grabbed food from the nearest thermopolium. Basically an ancient fast food joint. Big clay pots sat on counters, filled with stews and wine. Customers came with their cups and bowls, like a Roman version of takeout.
Work for the common people came in all shapes. Some were craftsmen, potters shaping jars, blacksmiths forging tools, weavers spinning cloth. Others were farmers bringing in produce from the fertile countryside. And then there were the laborers, the men who hauled goods at the docks, carried water, or swept streets. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the city moving. Money? Well, most folks earned just enough to scrape by. A day's wage might cover food and rent, but not much more. That's why taverns were so popular. They weren't just for eating and drinking, but also for socializing. Imagine small, smoky rooms filled with laughter, arguments, dice games, and cheap wine. If the villas were about elegance, the taverns were about survival and escape. And let's not forget the women of the common class. Many worked alongside their husbands in shops, selling bread or weaving cloth.
Some ran taverns themselves. Girls often married young and had children quickly, juggling family life with helping the household earn. Their lives were tough, but they were the backbone of Pompeii's busy streets. Then there were the slaves. If the poor worked hard, the slaves worked harder. They were everywhere, cooking, cleaning, building, farming, carrying messages, even working in the dangerous mines. Some were captured in wars, dragged from distant lands to serve Roman masters. Others were born into slavery in Pompeii itself. A few could earn or buy their freedom over time, but many lived and died as property. Still, their fingerprints are all over Pompeii's ruins. Literally, they laid the bricks, baked the bread, poured the wine. Without them, the city couldn't function.
Life for the commoners wasn't all sweat and hardship, though. They had their joys, too. Festivals were huge occasions. On religious holidays, even the poorest could join parades, feast in public squares, and cheer at games in the amphitheater. Gladiator fights were a big hit. Tickets were often free, sponsored by rich politicians hoping to win votes. Imagine the excitement. Poor farmers sitting shoulder to shoulder with merchants, yelling as their favorite fighter entered the arena. For a while, everyone forgot their struggles. And there was laughter. Pompeii's graffiti shows it. Carved into walls are jokes, insults, doodles, even love notes. One wall reads, "Secundus says hello to his friends." Another, "Celadus the gladiator makes the girls sigh." Some graffiti is so ordinary it's funny, like ancient Facebook status updates. It shows that even common folk wanted to leave their mark, no matter how small. Of course, the gap between rich and poor was always visible. Walk from a cramped insula into a grand villa, and you'd see the contrast immediately. The rich dined on oysters and wine, the poor ate porridge and hoped for meat on holidays. The rich lounged in marble baths, the poor washed at public fountains. The rich had gardens, the poor had alleyways. Yet, despite all this, Pompeii's poor kept the city alive with their labor. One thing that united them all, rich and poor alike, was religion. Temples dotted the city, and everyone, no matter their class, joined in festivals to honor Jupiter, Venus, or Bacchus. Commoners prayed for good harvests, safe travels, or just a lucky day at the dice table. Religion was part of everyday life, woven into the rhythm of work and rest. But underneath the daily grind, there was always uncertainty. Earthquakes rattled the city more than once. Fires broke out. Disease spread easily in crowded neighborhoods. And though people didn't realize it, the volcano looming above them was stirring. For the poor, there was no escape plan. If disaster struck, they couldn't flee to country villas or distant estates. They would be trapped where they lived, in small apartments, crowded streets, or chained to work. That's why, when we look at Pompeii today, the most haunting remains aren't just the wealthy frozen in their villas. It's also the ordinary people. The baker found in his shop. The family huddled together in a tiny room. The slave chained and left behind. Their struggles, their laughter, their dreams, all stopped in an instant. And maybe that's the real story of Pompeii's common folk. They didn't have marble walls, but they had lives full of grit, humor, and hope. They worked hard, loved fiercely, and tried to make the best of their world. When we walk through the ruins now, their voices still echo in the graffiti, the broken jars, the worn steps of taverns. Behind every glamorous villa was 100 smaller lives keeping it afloat. And while history often celebrates the rich, Pompeii reminds us, the heartbeat of a city is its common people. If work was the engine of Pompeii, entertainment was the fuel that kept everyone moving. And oh boy, the people of Pompeii loved their fun. From gladiators to gambling, from festivals to feasts, this city knew how to throw a party. If you lived in Pompeii, chances are you worked hard during the day, but you also played hard at night. Let's start with the big one, the amphitheater. This wasn't just any arena, it was one of the oldest stone amphitheaters in the Roman world, built long before the Colosseum in Rome. It could hold about 20,000 people, which was basically the whole population of Pompeii plus some out-of-town guests. Imagine walking in, stone seats rising around you, a wide-open arena in the middle, the buzz of the crowd. Merchants sold snacks. Yes, ancient Romans had their version of stadium food, probably bread, olives, and wine. Families sat together waiting for the show to start. And the show? Gladiators. Nothing drew a crowd like men fighting for honor, fame, and survival. Some gladiators were slaves or prisoners forced into the arena. Others volunteered, chasing glory and the roar of the audience. Each had their own style: heavy armor with a sword, a net and trident, or even wild beasts unleashed to spice things up. The crowd cheered, booed, placed bets. Gladiators were the celebrities of their day, painted on walls and adored like modern athletes. One piece of graffiti even reads, "Salatus the Thracian is the heartthrob of the girls." Yep, even back then, fangirls existed. But gladiators weren't the only entertainment. Pompeians loved theater too. The city had large and small theaters where plays were performed. Some were tragedies about gods and heroes. Others were comedies filled with slapstick jokes, gossip, and silly characters. People laughed at actors with exaggerated masks, much like how we laugh at sitcoms today. And of course, there were musical performances, flutes, harps, drums, filling the air with rhythm. Festivals were another huge deal. Religious life and entertainment often went hand in hand. On feast days, temples opened their doors, processions filled the streets, sacrifices were offered, and then everyone partied. Wine flowed, food was shared, music blared, and the city buzzed with energy. For the poor, this was often the best chance to enjoy luxuries usually reserved for the rich. For the rich, it was a chance to show off with banquets and generosity. Speaking of banquets, let's talk about feasting. Roman dinner parties weren't just meals, they were experiences. Guests reclined on couches, leaning on their elbows, while servants brought dish after dish. There were appetizers like eggs and olives, main courses like roasted boar or fish, and desserts with honeyed cakes and fruit. And of course, endless wine mixed with herbs, honey, or even seawater. Yes, they actually did that. Don't try it at home. Conversations flowed, poetry was recited, music played in the background. Sometimes the parties got a little wild, dancing, games, even drunken arguments. One ancient writer complained that in Pompeii, luxury and vice often went hand in hand. And then there was gambling. Dice games were everywhere, in taverns, on street corners, even scratched onto steps of buildings. People played for fun, but also for money. Some bets were small, others reckless. Picture a craftsman blowing his week's wages on a bad throw of dice. Romans believed in luck, and many carried charms or prayed to gods before rolling. If you've ever blamed bad dice on the gods, well, they actually meant it. Wine, too, was central to Pompeii's nightlife. Taverns sold it cheap for the masses, while villas served the finest vintages for elites. Drinking wasn't about sipping quietly, it was about loosening tongues and fueling laughter. Of course, sometimes it fueled trouble too. Drunken brawls weren't uncommon, especially when gambling or jealousy got involved. Now, Pompeii also had a reputation for something a little more risque. The city's brothels were famous, even by Roman standards. The Lupanar, the main brothel, had tiny rooms with stone beds, and above the doors were frescoes of different services, like an ancient menu. Customers could literally point at the painting of what they wanted. It sounds shocking to us, but for Pompeii, this was normal, even advertised. Graffiti inside shows visitors leaving comments, some proud, some hilarious, like, "I had a great time, thanks." Clearly, TripAdvisor wasn't needed. All of this, gladiators, festivals, gambling, taverns, brothels, painted Pompeii as a city of pleasure. And while it sounds fun, it also raised eyebrows. Roman moralists from outside Pompeii often criticized the city for being too indulgent, too wild, too sinful. They saw Pompeii as a place where people partied too much, cared too little, and forgot the discipline Rome was supposed to stand for. But the people of Pompeii didn't seem to care. Why should they? Life was short, and pleasures were many. If you worked hard in the fields or at the docks, why not spend your evening cheering at gladiators or rolling dice in a smoky tavern? If you were rich, why not show off your wealth with banquets and wild parties? And that's the fascinating thing about Pompeii. It wasn't just a city that lived, it was a city that lived loudly. Its walls are filled with graffiti of jokes, insults, love notes, and bets. Its villas are filled with art that still makes tourists blush. Its amphitheater once roared with cheers. Pompeii embraced life with both hands, squeezing every drop of joy from it. Yet, in hindsight, it's chilling, because all that laughter, all that excess, all that cheering, it stopped in a single day. The amphitheater went silent, the taverns closed forever, the dice rolled one last time, and the city's pleasures were buried under ash, frozen in time. When you walk through Pompeii now, you can still see the amphitheater seats, the brothel frescoes, the tavern counters with holes where pots once sat. You could almost hear the echoes of a crowd cheering, a gambler groaning, a drunk singing off-key. Entertainment and excess, Pompeii lived for them. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made the city so unforgettable. Okay, let's be honest. When people hear about Pompeii, one of the first things they whisper about, sometimes with a smirk, is the brothels. And yeah, Pompeii didn't just have them, it became famous for them. If gladiator arenas were the public stage of entertainment, brothels were the secret side room. Except, in Pompeii, they weren't even that secret. They were part of the city's identity. The most famous of them all was the lupanar. Even the name tells you everything. Lupa means she-wolf, which was Roman slang for prostitute. Step inside this building and you'd find a long corridor with tiny stone rooms on either side. Each room had a simple bed made of stone, maybe a mattress or blanket thrown on top. No marble floors here, no mosaics, no fountains, just plain walls. But above each doorway, there was art, frescoes, little paintings showing, well, let's just say, different services. Think of it like an ancient menu, but instead of words, you had pictures. Customers didn't need to ask, just point. The walls of the lupanar still carry graffiti from both workers and visitors. Some are funny, some are crude, and some are oddly sweet. One man carved, "I had a good time here." Another scribbled his name proudly, like a teenager writing, "I was here," on a desk. It's weird, but it makes you realize these were real people with real, very human urges. But brothels weren't only about sex. They were part of Pompeii's economy. Prostitutes were often slaves or poor women forced into the trade. They didn't keep much of the money, the owners of the brothels did. Some women might earn small freedoms, but most lived harsh, short lives. Behind the laughter of drunk customers, there was struggle, exhaustion, and sometimes pain. That's the darker truth.
Still, Pompeii didn't treat sex like something shameful. In fact, it was everywhere. Villas had frescoes that were shockingly bold. Even bakeries had carvings with suggestive symbols. Scholars believe this wasn't just about fun. It was also about fertility, prosperity, and warding off bad luck. The Romans often used images of male parts, yes, you know the one, as good luck charms. They carved them into streets, painted them on tavern walls, even wore them as pendants. Imagine walking into a shop and seeing one hanging like a horseshoe for luck. For us, it sounds shocking. For them, it was normal. The brothels, then, were just one piece of Pompeii's broader, open attitude. Unlike many later societies, Romans didn't wrap sex in silence. They saw it as natural,
part of life, and even part of business. Pompeii, sitting at the edge of empire and full of traders, sailors, and travelers, became a hotspot for this kind of business. Money flowed in, pleasures flowed out. But that doesn't mean everyone approved. Some Roman writers from outside Pompeii were disgusted by the city's reputation. They wrote about its corruption, its immorality, how it was a place of excess. To them, Pompeii was like that wild town your parents warn you about. Too much wine, too much gambling, too much temptation. And maybe they were right. Pompeii wasn't hiding its pleasures, it was advertising them.
Let's zoom in for a moment. Imagine walking down a busy Pompeian street at dusk. Oil lamps flicker, casting shadows on the stone walls. You hear laughter spilling out of taverns, the clink of dice on wooden tables, the shuffle of sandals on the road. Then, in a side alley, you see the Lupanar. Its entrance isn't glamorous, it's small and narrow, but inside the walls are alive with frescoes, voices, and deals being made. It's not quiet, it's not hidden, it's part of the city's rhythm. And here's the twist. Many of the erotic artworks weren't in brothels at all. They were in family homes. Imagine being invited to dinner at a villa, reclining on a couch, and looking up to see a wall painting that makes you blush. To the owners, it wasn't shameful. It was art, a symbol of fertility, wealth, and a reminder that life should be enjoyed. Pompeii wore its pleasures on its sleeve. That openness is part of why the ruins shock visitors today. Tourists walk through the Lupanar, see the paintings, and gasp. They whisper, they giggle, they take photos. But to a Pompeian, it was normal, just business. The real shock would probably be our modern embarrassment. Yet, behind the humor and fascination lies something darker. Many of the women in these places didn't choose that life. They were slaves, bought and sold, their bodies controlled by others. Some might have carved graffiti on the walls to mark their existence. Some might have found ways to joke, laugh, and survive. But the truth is, Pompeii's pleasures came at a cost, one that the wealthy and travelers paid in coins, while the poor paid with their lives. Still, the brothels tell us an unfiltered story of Pompeii. A city that embraced excess, a city where walls spoke openly of desire. A city that didn't hide its human cravings, but displayed them in paint and plaster. And that's why Pompeii feels so alive, even in death. Walk its streets, and you don't just see stones. You see laughter, gossip, flirting, secret meetings, and yes, a lot of blushing. You see a city that wanted to enjoy every moment without shame, without filters. And maybe that's the dark secret Pompeii carried. It was a jewel of Rome, but one built not just on trade and beauty, but also on desire, indulgence, and the struggles of those forced into its pleasures. The Lupanar still stands as proof. Its frescoes bright, its graffiti cheeky, its rooms silent now, but heavy with stories. When Vesuvius erupted, it buried not only villas and temples, but also these brothels. The plaster casts we see today include the rich, the poor, and perhaps even the women who worked those tiny stone rooms. Their world of excess ended in the same instant as everyone else's. The mountain didn't care if you were a senator, a baker, or a prostitute. Ash covered all. So next time you hear someone laugh about Pompeii's dirty secrets, remember, behind the jokes was a very human story, one of survival, struggle, and the strange way a city can be remembered forever. Not for its politics or wars, but for the art on its bedroom walls. Every city has its big neighbor. For Pompeii, that neighbor wasn't another city, it was a mountain. Mount Vesuvius stood tall and brooding just a few miles away. To the people of Pompeii, it was just part of the scenery. They farmed on its slopes, built villas with views of it, and drank wine made from its volcanic soil.
The mountain was like a quiet roommate, always there, never saying much. But here's the thing. Silence doesn't mean safety. Vesuvius wasn't asleep. It was just waiting. Now, the people of Pompeii weren't totally clueless. They had signs, strange ones. But humans are really good at ignoring uncomfortable truths, and Pompeii was no different. One of the clearest warnings came in 62 AD, almost 2 decades before the big eruption. An earthquake rattled the region so badly that buildings collapsed all over the city. Temples cracked, houses crumbled, and even the amphitheater needed repairs. For years afterward, you could still see scaffolding and reconstruction projects everywhere. But did people connect this earthquake to the volcano? Not really. Romans didn't fully understand volcanoes the way we do now. To them, it was just the gods showing anger or bad luck. So they rebuilt, painted over the cracks, and went on with their lives. There were smaller tremors too. The ground sometimes shook, walls sometimes cracked, but Pompeians got used to it. Imagine if every time your window rattled, you thought, the end is near. You'd go crazy. So people shrugged and kept drinking wine. And then there were the odd smells and sights. Travelers wrote about smoke rising from the mountain or the air tasting of sulfur on certain days. Some springs dried up, others bubbled strangely. Animals behaved oddly. But again, life went on. The farmers still worked the land, the vineyards still grew, and the taverns still poured their wine. The signs were there, but no one wanted to believe the giant could wake up. To be fair, Vesuvius didn't look like a killer. Today, it has that classic sharp volcanic cone. But back then, it was taller and more rounded, almost like a harmless green hill. Its slopes were covered in farms and villages. Grapes grew thick, and the wine made from Vesuvius's soil was famous across the empire. The mountain wasn't a monster, it was a provider. Why fear the thing that gave you food, wealth, and comfort? The funny part? Some Roman writers actually hinted at danger. The naturalist Pliny the Elder, who lived nearby, once wrote about the strange fires and unsettled ground in Campania. But even he didn't predict disaster. Nobody really thought the mountain could suddenly destroy everything around it. It was just there. And that's what makes this part of the story chilling. Pompeii had all the warnings, but they didn't look like warnings at the time. A crack in a wall here, a rumble there, a little smoke on the horizon. It all felt normal. People are good at normalizing danger when it creeps slowly. Think about it. The baker still opened his shop every morning. Kids still played dice in the streets. Merchants still shouted in the forum. Life carried on under the shadow of a ticking time bomb, but no one heard the ticking. Or maybe they did, but they told themselves, not today, maybe tomorrow, or maybe never.
The irony is, Pompeii celebrated the very thing that would kill it. They built shrines to Bacchus, the god of wine, right on the volcano's slopes. They drank the wine from its soil. They decorated villas with paintings of lush vineyards against Vesuvius's backdrop. They turned the sleeping giant into a symbol of life and prosperity. Nobody imagined it could flip into a symbol of death. If you walk through the ruins today, you can still see evidence of their denial. Some houses were mid-repair when the eruption came, scaffolding still up, tools left behind. Imagine painting your walls, fixing your roof, planning a feast, and then the sky suddenly falling. The signs were there. The mountain whispered through tremors, hinted through smoke, grumbled through earthquakes. But the whispers weren't loud enough, and so the city ignored them. And maybe that's why Pompeii's story feels so familiar even now. We humans don't like to think about danger when life is good. We'd rather enjoy the wine, laugh at the tavern, and fix the cracks in our walls than face the giant in the background. Pompeii wasn't destroyed without warning. It was destroyed because it didn't listen.
In hindsight, the mountain wasn't sleeping, it was stretching, yawning, and preparing to wake. And when it finally did, its first roar shook the world. Still, the brothels tell us an unfiltered story of Pompeii, a city that embraced excess, a city where walls spoke openly of desire, a city that didn't hide its human cravings but displayed them in paint and plaster. And that's why Pompeii feels so alive, even in death. Walk its streets, and you don't just see stones, you see laughter, gossip, flirting, secret meetings, and yes, a lot of blushing. You see a city that wanted to enjoy every moment without shame, without filters. And maybe that's the dark secret Pompeii carried. It was a jewel of Rome, but one built not just on trade and beauty, but also on desire, indulgence, and the struggles of those forced into its pleasures. The Lupanar still stands as proof. Its frescoes bright, its graffiti cheeky, its rooms silent now, but heavy with stories. When Vesuvius erupted, it buried not only villas and temples, but also these brothels. The plaster casts we see today include the rich, the poor, and perhaps even the women who worked those tiny stone rooms. Their world of excess ended in the same instant as everyone else's. The mountain didn't care if you were a senator, a baker, or a prostitute. Ash covered all. So next time you hear someone laugh about Pompeii's dirty secrets, remember, behind the jokes was a very human story, one of survival, struggle, and the strange way a city can be remembered forever, not for its politics or wars, but for the art on its bedroom walls.
It started like any other late summer morning, August 24th, 79 AD. The sun rose over the Bay of Naples, the markets opened, and Pompeii stirred awake. Bakers slid loaves into ovens, merchants arranged goods in stalls, and kids raced down the cobbled streets, laughing. Nobody knew it was their last normal morning. Nobody knew the sky would soon turn black. At first, it was just a sound, a deep, rumbling roar from Mount Vesuvius. People paused, looked up at the mountain, and then boom! The top of Vesuvius exploded. A column of smoke, ash, and rock shot into the sky so high it pierced the clouds. Imagine a mushroom-shaped tower of darkness rising above your city, blotting out the sun. Some people gasped, some prayed, some probably cursed, but everyone stared. Within an hour, ash began to fall. At first it was light, like a strange gray snow drifting down. Kids might have even thought it was fun. But then it thickened. Flakes became chunks. Roofs began to creak under the weight. People grabbed cloaks, covered their heads, and rushed through the streets. Merchants abandoned shops. Mothers grabbed children. Slaves dropped their tasks. The city's rhythm shattered. Panic grew. Ash fell thicker, mixing with pumice, light, sharp stones blown from the volcano. They rained down, bouncing off streets, cutting skin, smashing tiles. Some people tried to flee, running toward the gates of the city. Others huddled indoors, hoping thick walls would keep them safe. But there was no safe place. The air itself was turning deadly. By midday, darkness fell. Not evening darkness, not gentle twilight. Pitch black, like someone had pulled a heavy curtain over the sun. Lamps flickered weakly, but the ash choked the flames. People stumbled in chaos, coughing, choking, screaming for loved ones. Dogs howled, horses bolted, carts crashed. The world was ending, and Pompeii knew it. And still, the mountain roared. Every few minutes, another blast. Rocks the size of fists or bigger shot from the sky. Roofs collapsed, crushing families who thought home was safe. Streets filled with debris. Fire sparked. The air grew thick with sulfur, burning lungs and eyes. Pliny the Younger, who watched from across the bay, later wrote that it felt like the end of the world. Some people ran. Archaeologists have found skeletons of families at Pompeii's gates, clutching bags of coins and jewelry, trying desperately to escape. Others prayed in temples. Some tried to hide in cellars, only to be trapped as the ash piled higher. And some, frozen by fear, stayed where they were, unable to decide whether to flee or stay.
Hours passed, and the weight of ash grew heavier. Roofs sagged, beams cracked, walls buckled. The city groaned like a dying giant. Meanwhile, the sky rained not just ash and pumice, but also lightning, forked and furious, striking through the black clouds. Imagine thunder so loud it shook the stones beneath your feet. The gods weren't whispering anymore, they were screaming. Then came the pyroclastic surges, walls of burning gas and ash that raced down Vesuvius's slopes faster than any human could run. They hit Pompeii like a wave of death, searing, choking, unstoppable. Those who had survived the falling rocks and collapsing roofs now faced fire itself. In seconds, flesh burned, lungs scorched, and life ended. People collapsed mid-step, frozen forever in the positions archaeologists would later discover. A mother shielding her child, a man clutching a bag of coins, a dog twisted in its chain. By nightfall, Pompeii was buried. 20 feet of ash and stone smothered the city. The sky above was still black, glowing faintly red from the volcano's fury. Across the bay, survivors watched helplessly. Pliny wrote of ships struggling to stay afloat as ash rained into the sea. For them, it was a nightmare. For Pompeii, it was silence.
What makes this story so haunting is how fast it all happened. In less than 2 days, an entire city, 20,000 people, their homes, their art, their laughter, vanished. Time didn't slow down, it stopped. And here's the chilling detail. The ash that killed them also preserved them. Every loaf of bread in the ovens, every jar of wine in the cellar, every fresco on the walls, all sealed away in a gray tomb. The people of Pompeii never saw the sun rise again, but their world was captured like a photograph in stone. Walking through Pompeii today, you can still feel the weight of that day. The grooves in the streets where carts once rolled are filled with ash. The plaster casts of bodies lie in the same positions they died in, and the black shadow of Vesuvius still looms in the distance, quiet now, but never forgotten. The day the sky turned black wasn't just the end of Pompeii, it was the moment a city became eternal.
When Vesuvius first erupted, Pompeii was shaken, terrified, but still alive. People thought maybe, just maybe, if they waited it out, the mountain would calm down. But the real nightmare hadn't even started yet. The first day was ash, pumice, and chaos. The second day was fire. Let's step back into those final hours. By now, Pompeii was buried under several feet of ash. Roofs were collapsing, streets clogged, air thick with dust. Survivors huddled in basements, praying, coughing, holding on to hope. But Vesuvius wasn't done. The mountain unleashed its deadliest weapon, pyroclastic flows. Now, what's a pyroclastic flow? Imagine a cloud made of fire, ash, and toxic gas racing down a mountain at more but 100 miles per hour. It's hotter than any oven, over 400 degrees Celsius, and heavier than stone. It doesn't just burn, it crushes, smothers, and vaporizes everything in its path. That's what came for Pompeii.
The first surge slammed into the city before dawn. It roared like thunder, sweeping down the slopes and across the bay, a rolling wave of death. It tore through Herculaneum first, the smaller town closer to the volcano, instantly killing everyone there. Bodies were carbonized, turned to charcoal where they stood. Wooden beams ignited like matches. Boats on the shore burned to nothing. Then it came for Pompeii.
The flow didn't creep, it stormed in. Streets filled in seconds. People who had survived a full day of ashfall now faced fire itself. Flesh burned instantly, lungs filled with searing gas, brains boiled. Archaeologists later found skeletons twisted into grotesque positions, jaws open in silent screams. Some were caught mid-step, some curled into balls, some clutched loved ones as the heat overwhelmed them. In those moments, time wasn't just frozen, it was stolen. The stone walls of Pompeii buckled, temples cracked. The amphitheater that once rang with cheers now echoed with collapsing stones. Even the marble villas, so proud and sturdy, couldn't withstand the surge. Frescoes blistered, mosaics darkened, gardens shriveled to ash. Fire swept through courtyards, fountains boiled dry, and statues cracked in the heat. The city wasn't just buried, it was scorched alive. And the flows didn't come just once. Vesuvius hurled surge after surge, wave after wave of ash and fire. Each one buried the city deeper, sealing it under layers of stone. By the end, Pompeii was entombed beneath more than 20 feet of volcanic material. A living city turned into a tomb in less than 2 days. For those who tried to flee, the story wasn't much better. Some ran toward the sea, hoping ships could save them, but the bay itself boiled with falling ash. Waves rose and fell as volcanic debris hit the water. Ships capsized, sailors choked in the air. Others fled into the countryside, only to be overtaken by flows that spread miles beyond the city. Vesuvius didn't just destroy Pompeii, it scarred the whole region.
The destruction was total, and yet it was also strangely precise. The ash that suffocated Pompeii also preserved it. It sealed houses as they were, locked jars in place, and froze bodies in their last moments. Bread still sat in ovens, carbonized but intact. Dogs remained chained to posts, their bones arched as they strained for freedom. Human bodies decayed, but the voids they left in the ash remained. Centuries later, archaeologists would pour plaster into those voids and reveal the faces of Pompeii's dead, captured in heartbreaking detail. Walking through the ruins today, you see more than stones. You see people. A mother curled around her child, a man clutching a bag of coins, wealth that couldn't buy him a single breath. A soldier, armor still strapped to his chest, trying to stand his ground against nature's fury. Even a dog, twisted mid-motion, claws dug into the ground. These aren't just artifacts, they're echoes. And maybe that's the scariest part. Pompeii didn't just die, it was caught mid-scream. Unlike other ancient cities, which faded slowly from history, Pompeii was cut off in an instant. That's why it feels so alive, even in its death.
The mountain gave no mercy. Ash filled every room, fire cracked every stone, and smoke blackened the skies. When Vesuvius finally quieted, there was nothing left to hear. No footsteps, no laughter, no prayers. Just silence, broken only by the faint hiss of cooling rock. The jewel of Campania, the city of villas and markets, of taverns and temples, of laughter and excess, was gone. Fire, ash, and stone had erased it. But in erasing it, Vesuvius also preserved it. sealing a city not just in ruin, but in memory. When we look at Pompeii today, we don't just see ruins. We see the fingerprints of fire, the layers of ash, and the stone that swallowed an entire world. And in that stone, the stories still whisper.
And then, silence. When the last surge of fire rolled over Pompeii, the mountain finally began to quiet. The ground stopped shaking, the ash clouds thinned, and the roaring explosions faded into an eerie stillness. The once bustling city was gone, buried beneath more than 20 feet of volcanic rock. A city that had echoed with laughter, markets, and music just 2 days earlier now lay in a tomb of ash. The silence must have been terrifying for those who survived nearby. Imagine standing on a hillside miles away, watching the smoke still rise from the mountain. You knew that under all that gray dust, thousands of lives had been snuffed out. The streets you once walked, the taverns you once drank in, the neighbors you once argued with, all gone in a blink. Pompeii had vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. For survivors, the loss was almost too much to process. Families were ripped apart. Farmers who lived outside the city returned to find nothing but a gray wasteland where their homes once stood. Sailors who had docked in Pompeii's harbor found the port gone, choked with ash and rock. Even the rivers and streams shifted as the eruption reshaped the land. It wasn't just people who died, the whole landscape changed. And here's the strange part. Life outside Pompeii had to go on. Rome, busy with politics and wars, didn't pause long to mourn. Yes, the eruption was remembered as a tragedy. Pliny the Younger even wrote about it, describing the horror he saw from across the bay. But soon enough, the empire turned its attention elsewhere. Other cities, other battles, other events. Pompeii was gone, and with it, the daily lives of 20,000 souls faded into silence.
For centuries afterward, the city remained lost. Farmers plowed fields over the ash without knowing what lay beneath. Travelers passed by the slopes of Vesuvius, unaware they were walking over streets once filled with color and noise. The silence became so complete that Pompeii almost slipped out of memory altogether. It wasn't marked on maps. It wasn't spoken of much. It was as if it had never existed. And yet, survivors carried the memory in their hearts. Imagine the widow who escaped but lost her husband inside the city, or the merchant who fled with nothing but the clothes on his back, his shop buried forever under ash. Their stories must have been whispered to children and grandchildren. I lived in Pompeii once. It was beautiful, and then the mountains swallowed it. For them, the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. The silence also became a kind of protection. Ash, for all its destruction, is also a preservative. While time ate away at other Roman cities, Pompeii stayed locked in its tomb, untouched by invaders, untouched by weather, untouched even by thieves. The silence froze it in place. Shops still held jars of wine, loaves of bread carbonized in ovens. Jewelry sparkled on the fingers of those who never escaped. A city that should have been erased forever was instead held in suspended animation.
But in those first centuries, no one knew. To the outside world, Pompeii was simply gone. The amphitheater where crowds once cheered, gone. The temples where prayers rose, gone. The villas filled with laughter, music, and gossip, gone. Even the graffiti carved by ordinary people lost under layers of stone. It was as if the voices of Pompeii had been muted, locked away under a heavy gray blanket. There's something haunting about that silence.
Imagine walking the countryside around Vesuvius 50 years later. The mountain still smokes faintly, its slopes bare and scarred. The ground is gray and cracked. You step carefully, your sandals crunching on volcanic rock, knowing thousands lie beneath your feet. But you hear nothing. No laughter, no prayers, no clatter of carts, just the wind. And maybe that's why Pompeii's story still grips us today. Because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of what's missing. The city's silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, with all the voices cut short, the lives unfinished, the songs unsung. Over the years, the silence grew thicker. New generations forgot. The land was farmed, vineyards grew again, villages sprouted on the edges of Vesuvius. The ruins of Pompeii stayed hidden, buried deep, patient in their grave. The city waited. And that's where we leave this chapter, with Pompeii gone, covered in ash, silenced but not erased. The city would sleep in its gray tomb for more than 1,600 years before anyone uncovered it again. For the world, it was gone. For history, it was waiting. For more than 1,600 years, Pompeii lay buried in silence. The vineyards grew back, farmers tilled the soil, villages rose near Vesuvius. To the world, the city was gone. But history has a funny way of keeping secrets. And Pompeii, hidden under ash and stone, was waiting for someone curious enough to stumble upon it. The rediscovery didn't happen all at once. In the 1500s, workmen digging a canal near the Sarno River accidentally struck ancient walls. They didn't realize what they'd found, though. To them, it was just ruins. Maybe an old farmhouse, maybe a forgotten temple. Nobody shouted, "Hey, we found Pompeii!" The city remained nameless, still sleeping. Then, in the 1700s, things changed. A farmer digging a well hit stone walls with paintings still bright with color. Word spread, and soon treasure hunters arrived, hoping to find gold, jewels, anything shiny. They hacked through walls, carried off statues, and filled private collections. At first, the digging wasn't science, it was looting. Pompeii was treated like a chest of riches rather than a time capsule of history. But slowly, scholars realized this was something different. This wasn't just a ruin, this was an entire city, preserved like no other. Streets, houses, shops, temples, even graffiti on walls had survived. The ash that had destroyed Pompeii had also protected it, keeping it safe from weather, war, and time itself. It was like stepping through a doorway straight into the Roman world. Imagine the shock of those first excavators. They uncovered a bakery with ovens still intact, complete with carbonized loaves of bread. They walked into villas with frescoes glowing red, blue, and gold, as if painted yesterday. They found wine amphoras still sealed, coins scattered on tables, jewelry clasped in skeleton hands. It wasn't just ruins, it was life, frozen mid-step. And then came the most haunting discovery of all, the voids. Archaeologists noticed strange hollows in the hardened ash. When they poured plaster into these gaps, they revealed the shapes of human bodies, men, women, children, caught in their final moments. Some lay curled on the ground, hands over faces. Others reached out as if trying to escape. One mother held her child tightly in her arms. The plaster cast showed not just bones, but fear, struggle, and love. Suddenly, Pompeii wasn't just history, it was heartbreak. By the 1800s, news of Pompeii spread across Europe. Artists, writers, and travelers flocked to see it. The Romantic poets called it haunting and beautiful. Artists sketched its ruins. Tourists wandered its streets with torches, marveling at houses, theaters, and temples that had been silent for centuries. Pompeii became a window into the past, a place where you could walk Roman streets as if time itself had stopped. And yet, rediscovery brought controversy. Some people were scandalized by the erotic frescoes and statues uncovered. Whole rooms were filled with paintings that Victorians found far too improper. In fact, many pieces were locked away in a secret cabinet in Naples, accessible only to serious gentlemen. Yes, they literally had a museum room for things considered too spicy for public eyes. But whether hidden or displayed, Pompeii revealed a side of Roman life that history books often left out. The excavations also changed archaeology itself. Pompeii taught scholars that ancient life wasn't just about temples and kings. It was about ordinary people, their shops, their graffiti, even their bread. Every artifact, no matter how small, told a story. Suddenly, history felt human. Today, walking through Pompeii feels surreal. You stroll down stone streets where ruts from cartwheels still groove the ground. You pass bakeries with stone mills, taverns with counters still in place, houses with mosaics of dogs at the door, Cave Canem, beware of the dog. You see gardens recreated from seeds found in the ash, fountains that once splashed, and temples where incense once burned. It feels less like ruins and more like a stage set waiting for its actors to return. But the most powerful moment still comes when you see the plaster casts, frozen faces of men, women, children, even animals. Their final moments immortalized by the very ash that killed them. Some casts show terror, others calm acceptance, others desperate clinging. They remind us that these weren't just Romans, they were people, not so different from us. Pompeii's rediscovery was more than a historical find. It was a reminder that life can end suddenly, that nature holds power greater than empires, and that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. The ghost city had waited quietly for centuries, and when it returned to the world, it brought with it not just stones and frescoes, but voices, whispers of markets, laughter in taverns, prayers in temples, and screams on that final day. Pompeii was silent for 1,600 years. Now, it will never be silent again.
If Pompeii's ruins tell us about Roman life, the plaster casts tell us about Roman death. And they're the part of Pompeii that visitors never forget. Streets, villas, and frescoes might impress you, but it's the frozen shapes of people, their bodies caught in their final moments, that follow you long after you leave. The story of these casts began in the 1800s. Archaeologists noticed something strange while digging through the hardened ash. Beneath the layers, they sometimes found hollow spaces. Not just random holes, but shapes. A curled arm, a bent knee, the outline of a face. These voids, it turned out, were where bodies had once been. The ash had buried people, hardened around them, and preserved their shapes long after flesh and bone decayed. The people were gone, but their final positions remained, like shadows trapped in stone. Then came the idea. The archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli in 1863 decided to pour liquid plaster into these voids. When the plaster hardened, he carefully chipped away the ash around it. What appeared was shocking, a full, lifelike cast of a person, frozen at the moment of death. Not statues, not carvings, real people, captured as they were in 79 AD.
The first casts stunned the world. You could see expressions, clothing folds, even the desperate poses of people who tried to shield themselves from the ash. Some covered their mouths, others stretched out hands as if reaching for help. The detail was so intimate that it felt like the people of Pompeii had stepped out of history to stare right back at us. And it wasn't just one or two. Dozens, then hundreds of casts were made. Entire families appeared, huddled together in their homes. A mother wrapped around her child. A man lying with his arms shielding his head. A slave still chained, unable to escape. One cast shows a dog twisted mid-struggle, its collar still around its neck. These weren't anonymous skeletons, they were people with gestures so familiar you could imagine them today. The casts turned Pompeii from ruins into a tragedy. Walking the streets, you might admire the mosaics or marvel at the frescoes. But when you turn a corner and see the curled form of a child or the twisted agony of a man caught mid-breath, the city suddenly feels alive. Or rather, it feels alive in its death.
And it's haunting. Think about it. These people never expected their last moment to be remembered forever. They were just living, eating, working, laughing, when the mountain came. Their final cries, their final movements became immortal in ash. Unlike most of history's dead, whose voices fade, the people of Pompeii left their bodies behind as testimony. They remind us that history isn't just kings and wars, it's humans, fragile and fleeting. The plaster casts also changed archaeology. They weren't just scientific finds, they were emotional. Visitors from the 19th century often wept when they saw them. Writers and poets described them as statues of pain. Some were even scandalized, arguing that showing such raw death was too much. But others believed the casts were essential because they gave faces to the nameless. They made us see Pompeii not as a ruin, but as a place where real people lived and died. And it's true, the details are staggering. In some casts, you can see belts and sandals, in others, the folds of a tunic. One cast even showed the wrinkles of a blanket someone pulled over themselves, hoping it might protect them. These little things, the curve of a hand, the arch of a back, speak louder than any scroll or inscription. Of course, time hasn't been kind to all the casts. Some have cracked, some crumbled, and archaeologists today use new techniques, even 3D scanning, to preserve them without damage. But the feeling remains the same. Standing in front of them, you can't escape the thought. These were people like us. They laughed, they worried, they loved, and they died. One of the most heartbreaking casts shows a group of people who tried to flee together. Their bodies fell close, some reaching for one another. Another shows a man lying face down, arms outstretched, as if he collapsed mid-run. And then there's the child, curled on the ground as if asleep. Seeing that, you realize Pompeii wasn't just a disaster. It was thousands of personal tragedies all happening at once. Today, visitors still come face to face with these haunting figures. Some are displayed under glass, others lie in the very streets where they fell. Tourists lean in, whisper, or fall silent. Nobody jokes in front of the casts. They are too human, too raw. And maybe that's why Pompeii grips us so much. The ruins show us what the Romans built, the frescoes show us what they dreamed. But the casts show us who they were and how suddenly it all ended. When you walk away from Pompeii, it's not the walls you remember. It's those faces, those hands, those twisted bodies whispering across the centuries, "We were here, we lived, and we died." When you walk through Pompeii today, it isn't the big temples or the grand villas that feel the most alive. It's the little details, the graffiti scratched into walls, the bread ovens still filled with loaves, the worn steps of taverns where countless sandals scuffed the stone. Pompeii's ruins whisper, not with speeches of emperors or records of wars, but with the voices of ordinary people who lived, laughed, and argued in this city. Let's start with the graffiti. And oh boy, Pompeii had a lot of it. More than 10,000 examples have been found carved into walls all over the city. People wrote about everything: love notes, political slogans, dirty jokes, insults, even random doodles. One wall reads, "Gaius loves Aemilia." Another declares proudly, Secundus fears hello to his friends. Some are surprisingly modern, like one that simply says, I don't like you. Honestly, that could be a text message today. Then there were the brags. Salatus the gladiator makes the girls sigh. Or Successus loves Iris, but she doesn't care for him. It's funny, 2,000 years have passed, but people haven't changed much. They still wanted to carve their crushes and complaints where everyone could see. And not all graffiti was romantic. Some was political, urging citizens to vote for certain candidates. Others were practical, like messages scribbled on tavern walls, warning about cheaters in dice games. Walking through Pompeii feels less like visiting a ruin and more like scrolling through an ancient social media feed. The walls talked, and they still do.
But graffiti wasn't the only whisper left behind. Shops and homes also tell stories. In one bakery, archaeologists found carbonized loaves of bread stamped with the baker's name. You can almost smell them, pulled from the oven just before disaster struck. In taverns, stone counters with holes still stand, where jars of wine and stew once simmered. Imagine leaning on one of those counters, sipping cheap wine, and arguing with your neighbor about gladiator matches. Some whispers are heartbreaking. In one house, a table was set for dinner, cups and plates waiting. In another, amphora of wine stood sealed, ready for a feast that never happened. These details remind us that Pompeii wasn't preparing for death, it was preparing for life when the eruption interrupted. Even the mosaics whisper. At the entrance to some villas, you'll find mosaics of dogs, with the words cave canem, beware of the dog. In others, playful fish scenes, dramatic battles, or even mythological love stories. One villa, the famous House of the Faun, has a giant mosaic of Alexander the Great in battle. Imagine walking on that floor every morning to get breakfast. The art wasn't just decoration, it was identity, pride, and personality.
And then there are the small things. Jewelry clasped on skeletons, coins in pouches, combs, cooking pots, lamps shaped like animals. Each object feels like a whisper from the person who held it last. A bracelet tells us about a woman's fashion sense. A coin pouch tells us someone tried to escape with savings. A child's toy ball reminds us that kids laughed and played here too. Pompeii's whispers aren't always glamorous though. Some remind us of the grittier side of city life. Public toilets, yes, they had them, still stand, showing that sanitation was, let's say, communal. Street stepping stones reveal how messy the roads got with cart ruts and mystery liquids. The amphitheater, once full of cheers, still echoes with the memory of a giant brawl between Pompeians and their neighbors from Nuceria. That fight was so bloody, the Roman Senate banned gladiator games in Pompeii for 10 years. The ruins whisper, and sometimes they laugh. Yeah, people misbehaved here too. But maybe the loudest whispers come from the small, personal touches. A wall painting of Venus, the goddess of love, found in a modest home, shows someone's devotion. A shop sign painted with a goat reminds us how businesses advertised without billboards. Even the placement of rooms in houses whispers about family life. Courtyards for gathering, little shrines for worship, tiny kitchens where food simmered.
All of this makes Pompeii unique. Most ruins show us stones. Pompeii shows us people. Not just the rich, but everyone. The baker, the tavern keeper, the gladiator, the slave, the gossiping teenager. It's almost like the city wanted to be remembered in every detail, down to the doodles on its walls. And maybe that's why Pompeii feels so alive even in death. The ruins don't shout grand history, they whisper everyday humanity. They remind us that the people who lived there weren't so different from us. They worried, they worked, they fell in love, they argued, they joked, they dreamed. Their whispers survived under ash, waiting centuries to be heard again. Walk those silent streets today, and you'll hear them if you listen closely. The tap of sandals, the laughter of kids, the clink of cups in a tavern, the scratch of a stylus carving a love note into plaster. The whispers of Pompeii say, "We were here, we mattered, and we still speak." Every tragedy leaves behind lessons, whether people choose to learn from them or not. Pompeii is no different. The city's sudden death is haunting, but it also carries warnings about nature, about life, and about the choices humans make when they think they're untouchable. The first and most obvious lesson is that nature always wins. The Romans were powerful. They built roads that stretched across continents, aqueducts that carried water for miles, temples that touched the sky. They conquered nations and called themselves masters of the world. But all that power meant nothing when Vesuvius roared. In less than 2 days, the volcano erased an entire city. No army, no wealth, no walls could stand against fire and ash. Pompeii teaches us that no matter how advanced or strong we feel, nature has the final word. The second lesson is about ignoring warnings. Remember the earthquake in 62 AD? The tremors that followed? The strange smoke rising from the mountain? All signs were there, but people explained them away. Life was good. Why worry? And isn't that still us today? We see storms growing stronger, seas rising, forests burning. Sometimes we nod, say, "Yes, that's bad," and then carry on as if tomorrow will be fine. Pompeii whispers to us, ignoring the giant in the background doesn't make it disappear.
Another lesson lies in the fragility of luxury. Behind marble walls, Pompeii's elites feasted, decorated their villas, and bragged about their wealth. But in the end, they died the same way as farmers and slaves. The plaster casts remind us, when disaster comes, gold bracelets, silver cups, and fine mosaics don't matter. What matters are the people, the connections, the small human moments. Pompeii shows us how quickly status fades when the ground shakes beneath everyone's feet. But Pompeii also teaches us about memory. Most cities of the ancient world disappeared slowly, ruined by war, decay, or abandonment. Pompeii was different. It was frozen in an instant. That's why it speaks to us so loudly today. It teaches us that the ordinary is just as important as the extraordinary. The graffiti, the bread in the ovens, the scribbled insults on walls. Those are the things that let us truly know the Romans. The lesson? History isn't just emperors and battles. It's the daily lives of ordinary people. There's also a quieter, personal lesson. Life is fragile, so don't take it for granted. The people of Pompeii woke up on what seemed like an ordinary day. Some went to the market, some to the baths, some stayed home to cook dinner. They didn't know it would be their last morning. None of us ever do. Pompeii whispers to us, live fully, love deeply, don't put off what matters, because you never know when the sky might turn black.
At the same time, Pompeii teaches resilience, strange as that sounds. The city was destroyed, yes, but in being destroyed, it was preserved. Its silence became its strength. When archaeologists uncovered it, Pompeii became immortal in a way few other places are. The people who died there still have voices today because their city refused to vanish completely. Out of destruction came remembrance. Out of silence came stories. And then there's the lesson of humility. Pompeii reminds us that civilizations, no matter how mighty, are not permanent. Rome seemed eternal, yet one eruption erased one of its brightest jewels. Our own modern cities, with skyscrapers and technology, aren't invincible either. Pompeii whispers to us, pride is fragile, empires crumble, the earth outlives us all. Finally, Pompeii teaches us something unexpected, the value of curiosity. If no one had cared to dig, to study, to preserve, Pompeii might still lie underground, forgotten. But because people were curious, we now walk its streets, read its graffiti, and touch its mosaics. Curiosity turned a tragedy into a classroom, a silent city into a teacher. And maybe that's the greatest lesson. When we look at the past honestly, even in its darkest moments, we understand ourselves better. So, what does Pompeii tell us here and now? It says, respect nature, listen to warnings, cherish life, stay humble, stay curious. These lessons are not buried, they're written in ash, carved in stone, whispered through plaster casts. All we have to do is listen. Because if we don't, history has a way of repeating itself. Pompeii is quiet now. You can walk its streets, hear only your own footsteps, and feel the warm Italian sun shining where ash once fell. But beneath that silence, beneath the stones and frescoes lies a secret, a dark one, a reminder that beauty and terror can exist side by side, and that human pride often forgets how fragile it really is. The dark secret of Pompeii isn't just that it was destroyed in a single day. Plenty of cities in history have been destroyed by war, fire, flood. The secret is how much life it lived before, and how much of that life was built on denial, indulgence, and forgetting the shadow that loomed above. Pompeii was a jewel, yes, but it was also a city of extremes. Behind marble walls, the rich feasted while slaves toiled. In taverns and brothels, pleasure was bought at the cost of someone else's suffering. In the amphitheater, crowds cheered as men bled in the sand. The people lived loudly, laughed freely, and indulged deeply, but they also ignored the rumbling beneath their feet. They saw cracks in walls, tremors in the ground, smoke on the horizon, and still they said, tomorrow will be the same as today. That's the secret. Pompeii wasn't destroyed without warning. It was destroyed because it refused to listen, because comfort was louder than caution, and pleasure was stronger than fear. The city believed it was eternal. The mountain reminded it otherwise. But here's the twist. Pompeii didn't vanish. It was buried, but preserved. Its sins and splendors, its laughter and pain, its murals and graffiti, all locked in ash. And now, centuries later, we see everything. The beauty, the excess, the cruelty, the love, the denial. No other city from the ancient world is so naked before us. Pompeii's secret is that it cannot hide. And maybe that's why it fascinates us so much. Because when we look at Pompeii, we're not just looking at Romans, we're looking at ourselves. We see our love of comfort, our taste for pleasure, our habit of ignoring warnings. We see our need to leave marks on walls, our laughter in taverns, our prayers in temples. We see our pride. And we see what happens when pride meets nature. The ruins don't shout this lesson. They whisper it through the plaster casts of people frozen mid-breath, through the graffiti of a lovesick teenager, through the bread left in ovens, waiting for hands that never returned. They whisper, don't forget. This is what happens when you forget the mountain. And so Pompeii's dark secret never fades, not because it was destroyed, but because it was preserved. It is a mirror, forcing us to look at our own lives, our own cities, our own choices. Are we listening to the warnings around us, or are we laughing, feasting, and saying, not today, maybe tomorrow, or maybe never? Pompeii doesn't answer that question. It doesn't need to. Its silence says enough. As you leave its streets behind, whether in person or in imagination, you carry the whispers with you, the laughter that turned to screams, the beauty that turned to ash, the warnings that were ignored, a city that lived louder than most, but died faster than any. That is Pompeii's dark secret, and that is why it still haunts us 2,000 years later under the shadow of the mountain. Pompeii may have been buried in 79 AD, but the city didn't vanish. It echoes. And not just in dusty textbooks or museum glass cases. Pompeii's voice is everywhere. Quiet, persistent, woven into art, food, stories, and even the way we think about ourselves. It's a city that refuses to die because it keeps finding new ways to whisper to the living. Let's start with art. Before Pompeii was uncovered, most people imagined Romans as stiff marble statues, noble, serious, heroic. But Pompeii revealed something else entirely. Its frescoes showed bright colors, cheeky humor, and, well, a lot of very bold images that would make even modern visitors blush. Scenes of gods lounging, lovers embracing, gardens blooming, birds fluttering. It was like stepping into a gallery where daily life mixed with dreams. Painters and designers in the 18th and 19th centuries were blown away. They borrowed Pompeii's colors and styles, copying the reds, blues, and golds that decorated its walls. Even today, if you've ever walked into a house with murals or floor mosaics inspired by the classics, you're hearing Pompeii's echo. Then there's food. When archaeologists uncovered carbonized loaves of bread from ovens, still perfectly round with scored tops, it was as if time had frozen mid-meal. Recipes scratched into walls or preserved in notes told us about Roman diets: wine with honey, lentil stews, roasted meats, seafood from the bay. Historians and chefs tried recreating those meals. Imagine biting into bread baked from the very recipe someone in Pompeii used 2,000 years ago. That's not just history, it's communion with the past. Even the wine of Pompeii echoes today. Vineyards around Vesuvius still produce bottles labeled with pride, Lacrima Christi, the tears of Christ, grown in volcanic soil. Each sip carries the flavor of the same earth that once both fed and destroyed the city. Literature, too, hums with Pompeii's echoes. When rediscovery spread across Europe, writers couldn't resist. Poets called it a city of ghosts. Novelists set romances and tragedies among its ruins. One famous novel, The Last Days of Pompeii by Edward Bulwer Lytton, turned the eruption into a backdrop for love, betrayal, and faith, thrilling Victorian readers. Ever since, Pompeii has been cast in stories, films, even video games. Every retelling is another echo, bouncing across time, reminding us that the city's drama never truly ended. But the strongest echoes aren't in art or books. They're in the lessons Pompeii forced us to learn. Archaeology itself was transformed by this city. Before Pompeii, digs were mostly treasure hunts. Grab the statues, take the gold, move on. Pompeii showed that ordinary things mattered. A child's toy, a piece of graffiti, a loaf of bread. All these small details told bigger truths than piles of coins. Thanks to Pompeii, archaeology became about people, not just kings and monuments. That shift changed how we study every ancient culture. The city taught us to value whispers, not just shouts. And then there's the echo of warning. Every time we hear about natural disasters today, earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes, Pompeii comes to mind. It reminds us that no matter how confident we are in technology or wealth, nature still rules. Its ash clouds roll forward in memory every time a modern volcano erupts in Iceland, Japan, or Indonesia. When we see towns evacuated under smoke-filled skies, it feels like Pompeii is leaning forward through time, whispering, "Remember me. Don't think it can't happen again."
There's also something more personal in Pompeii's echoes. When you look at the plaster casts of people, you see individuals, not anonymous Romans, but faces twisted in fear, hands grasping, children curled against mothers. You can't help but think, that could be me. That could be my family. Pompeii collapses the distance between then and now. It makes history human. That's why tourists still stand in silence before those casts. They're not just looking at the past, they're hearing themselves. The echoes reach even further, into philosophy. Some people see Pompeii as a reminder of how fleeting life is. One moment you're baking bread, the next, the sky is falling. That's why the Latin phrase carpe diem, seize the day, feels so sharp here. Pompeii whispers it louder than any poet ever did. Others see it as a lesson in humility. Empires rise, villas glitter, temples tower, but in the end, ash buries all. Pride crumbles, but memory lingers. And maybe that's Pompeii's greatest echo, memory. Because the city didn't just survive in ruins, it survived in us. Every artist inspired, every chef baking ancient bread, every tourist wandering its streets, every writer imagining its people, all of them keep Pompeii alive. It echoes not just across centuries, but in the way we see our own fragile lives. Pompeii doesn't shout, it whispers. Through walls, bread, mosaics, graffiti. Through ashes that became plaster, through warnings that became stories. And as long as someone listens, the city never truly dies.
Mount Vesuvius looks peaceful today. Its slopes are green, dotted with villages and vineyards. Tourists climb to the crater, lean over the railing, and snap selfies. Families picnic in its shadow. Life hums cheerfully at its base, as if nothing ever happened. But the mountain remembers, and if you listen closely, you realize the mountain is still watching. Scientists know this. That's why Vesuvius is one of the most closely monitored volcanoes in the world. Seismographs trace every tremor, satellites map its heat, sensors sniff for sulfur gases. The reason? Because history isn't finished here. Vesuvius will erupt again. Experts don't say if, they say when. And that's what makes Pompeii's story so haunting. The disaster is not locked in the past. It's a shadow hanging over the present. And what a shadow it is. The Bay of Naples today is home to more than 3 million people. The city of Naples sprawls right up to the volcano's slopes. Villages climb the hillsides, their houses glowing at night like stars clinging to the mountain. All those people live where Pompeii once did, where Herculaneum once burned. They live in the embrace of a giant that has already proven what it can do. So why stay? Because the soil is still rich, the climate still kind, the views still breathtaking. Just like the Romans, people live here because Vesuvius gives as much as it takes. Grapes grown on its slopes still make prized wine. Tourists bring money. The mountain feeds even as it threatens. Life, as always, is a gamble.
But the whispers of Pompeii linger. Every tremor shakes not only the ground, but also memory. In 1944, during World War II, Vesuvius erupted again. Not as violently as in 79 AD, but enough to spew ash over towns and destroy villages. American soldiers stationed nearby snapped photos of the plume, standing stunned just as Pliny had centuries earlier. The mountain reminded everyone, "I'm still here." And that's the unnerving truth. Vesuvius is quiet, but not dead. It breathes, it waits. Modern disaster plans exist, escape routes are mapped, but when millions live at its feet, the risk is enormous. Pompeii's story is not only history, it's a prophecy. The mountain still watches, and one day it will speak again. But maybe that's why Pompeii matters so much. It's not just about a past disaster. It's about the choices we make when we live in the shadow of danger. Do we listen to the warnings, or do we, like the Pompeians, shrug and say, "Not today, maybe tomorrow"?
Standing in Pompeii's ruins, you feel the mountain looming behind you. It's silent, green, almost gentle. But you know what it did. You know what it can do. The plaster casts whisper from the ground. The frescoes glow faintly in the sun. The stones hold the memory of footsteps long gone. And above it all, Vesuvius stares back, patient and watchful. That's the final secret of Pompeii. The city died, but the mountain didn't. The mountain lives on, carrying its dark memory, its unfinished warning. And as long as people build homes, plant vineyards, and laugh in its shadow, Pompeii's story isn't over. It lingers, waiting for its next chapter to be written in fire. So yes, Pompeii is a ruin, but Vesuvius is not. And the mountain, calm for now, is still watching.